She walked in with quiet steps and a leather folder. He walked over like he owned the place and made sure she knew she didn't. No one looked twice when she stepped through the courthouse doors. The morning buzz hadn't quite settled in, and yet the silence around her arrival was louder than anything that followed. Danielle Monroe crossed the marble floor without a sound, gray slacks brushing over well-worn heels. The security guard barely lifted his eyes from his crossword puzzle. The clerk at the front desk gave her a glance, saw the plain blouse and no makeup, and returned to sipping lukewarm coffee. Courtroom 4B was colder than the hallway, the kind of cold that settled in your bones, not from the temperature, but from the atmosphere. Danielle's fingers curled around the edges of her folder as she pushed open the heavy wooden door. The hinges didn't creak. Nothing did. Just a hush, dry and slow, like the whole room had been holding its breath for years. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Inside, the judge sat perched on the bench like he was made of concrete. His nameplate, Honig R. Harland, looked more polished than his expression. He shuffled through the docket with a face that said Monday mornings weren't worth the ink they were printed on. The bailiff, mid-40s and hollow-eyed, didn't bother announcing her. A handful of jurors whispered among themselves. Some glanced up. Most didn't. The only one who really saw her was a woman in the corner with a broom and a backache. Alberta Jenkins. Her headscarf was neatly tied. Her broom paused mid-sweep. She watched Danielle like she was staring at a ghost, or perhaps a memory she wasn't ready to face. Danielle took her seat at the defense table, folder resting gently atop the polished wood. Across the aisle, the prosecution was already in place. A single man, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and all smug. Officer Carl Readington. She'd heard of him. Almost everyone had. "You sure you're in the right room, sweetheart?" His voice cut through the air like cheap perfume, sticky, lingering, unwanted. Danielle said nothing. Carl leaned back in his chair, one leg over the other, arms folded like he was posing for a local paper. He smirked as he stood, casually sauntering past her with the slow confidence of someone who'd never been questioned. Then, without warning, he let a folder fall, slap, down in front of her. "Careful with that legal stuff," he said, flashing teeth. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." A couple of soft chuckles followed, one from the clerk's desk, another from a juror in the back row, the kind of laugh that curdled before it could rise, the kind that didn't belong to humor, only to comfort, a shared comfort among those who'd already decided who did and didn't belong. Judge Harlan didn't react, didn't look up, didn't care. Danielle remained still. Then, slowly, she picked up the folder, smoothed the crease where it had struck her chest, and set it aside like it was nothing more than a leaflet in the wind. She raised her eyes, not in anger, not in challenge, but in the kind of measured silence that turned attention inward. "Sometimes, officer," she said evenly, "the loudest man in the room is just trying to hide how little he knows." Carl blinked. His smile cracked, not broken, just strained. Alberta didn't smile, but she nodded. Once, subtly, as if confirming something to herself. Under her breath, she whispered, "That's Louie's girl." Danielle turned toward the bench as Judge Harland flipped another page. "Case 347, he muttered. People versus Matthew Langston. Representation by... let's see here. Danielle Monroe." Danielle raised a hand slightly, professional and poised. "Danielle, Your Honor." Harlan didn't apologize, didn't look up. Just let the error hang like dust in the air before muttering again. "Right. Proceed when ready, Miss Danielle." There it was. Again. The deliberate mispronunciation. Twice now. Danielle didn't correct him. She stood. Calm. Centered. "My client has been held for 5 days without cause," she said, "with no due process, and based on a report that, if the court permits, I intend to prove was fabricated." Harlan glanced up at last, eyes squinting as if the woman speaking was only now coming into focus. "You've got 5 minutes," he said flatly. "Keep it tight." The courtroom shifted. A murmur passed between the pews. The bailiff coughed. Even Alberta moved her broom again, this time just a few inches, just enough to acknowledge something was changing. Danielle's voice stayed even, but the air cooled. "So, yes," she said, "I'll be keeping it tight, tight enough to squeeze out the truth." That was when Carl stood again. "If I may clarify something first," he said, voice loud, hands on hips. Harlan didn't hesitate. He waved his hand as if shooing away a fly. "Go ahead, Officer Readington. Make it quick." Quick! That word again, like a leash meant to shorten her voice, her time, her power. Danielle exhaled, then returned to her seat. Her hand still touched the table, grounded and present. She didn't argue, didn't object. She let the system move as it always had, against her. Carl stepped forward, his shoes thudding across the floor like declarations. He turned to the jury, tapped the mic, twice, and began. "Ma'am here keeps saying my report skipped steps," he said, gesturing to Danielle without looking at her. "But I've been on this force 12 years. I know how to write up a clean case." He made eye contact with jurors, smiled, performed. "And I've never had trouble explaining things until now." Danielle didn't move. She watched him talk, watched the room watch him. The show was familiar. The same act she'd seen staged 100 different ways, in 100 different rooms, under 100 different names. But the pattern never changed, just the actors. Her turn would come, and when it did, she would not need the volume. She had something sharper, the law. Danielle's face stayed unreadable, but inside her hand, resting just under the edge of her sleeve, her fingers gently pressed a button, discreet and small. A signal. Nothing showy. Nothing that would draw eyes. Just initiated. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. It would feel it soon. Carl smiled wider, turning from the jury back to the bench. "I rest my comment, Your Honor." Harlan didn't nod, didn't respond. Danielle waited, eyes lowered. Then, slowly, she rose. The silence returned. Not respectful, not curious. Tense. The kind of silence that falls when something true is about to be said, and something false is about to fall apart. He brought noise. She brought footnotes. Carl Readington returned to his seat like a man stepping down from a stage he assumed he owned. The courtroom had fallen into the kind of quiet where even shifting in your seat felt loud. Danielle Monroe, however, didn't shift. She rose again, not with urgency, not with force, but with purpose. "Officer Readington," she began, flipping open the slim binder tucked into her folder. "In your statement, you cited subsection 11F of the Georgia Criminal Code as justification for the immediate detainment of my client. Is that correct?" Carl tilted his head slightly, arms crossed. "I did." Danielle nodded once. "Could you confirm for the record that 11F was your stated basis?" "I said I did, didn't I?" She didn't flinch. "Yes, you did." She turned a page and raised her eyes, finally. "Subsection 11F was repealed in 2018. Carl blinked. She continued calmly. "It was replaced by 12B, which clearly states that nonviolent offenses involving no prior record cannot result in holding beyond 24 hours without express written authorization from a superior." The room didn't react all at once. It was more like the slow turning of heads, one juror to another, the creak of a bench, the scratch of a pen freezing mid-note. Alberta Jenkins stopped sweeping again. She didn't lean on the broom this time. She folded her arms across her chest. Danielle paused. "You detained Mr. Langston for 5 days. Carl's jaw tightened. "That new policy," Danielle didn't raise her voice, "was signed and enacted by this very court, January 3rd, 2019, with your signature at the bottom, Your Honor." Harlan blinked. His gaze dropped to his docket like it had turned into something foreign. Carl glanced at him for help. Harlan didn't offer any. Danielle let the moment settle. It wasn't about embarrassment. It wasn't about shame. It was about facts, layered precisely like bricks. Carl tried to recover. "I've served this county longer than most in this room have practiced law." Danielle's voice remained steady. "Longevity does not equal legality." A quiet exhale rippled from the benches, the sound of tension cracking. Harlan shifted. "Let's keep this focused." Danielle nodded once. "Gladly, Your Honor." She walked toward the exhibit table, unrolling the original arrest log. She placed it down gently. "This," she said, "shows the timestamp of Mr. Langston's arrest." She placed a second document beside it. "This is the dispatch transcript, received an hour after the arrest." The gallery stirred again. Carl didn't move. "And this," she said, placing the final sheet beside the others, "is the jail check-in record. 5 full days between arrest and arraignment, with no written authorization." The room was still, not reverent, stunned. Alberta whispered under her breath, just loud enough to herself, "She came ready." Danielle didn't respond to the growing murmur. She simply straightened the papers, tapped them into alignment, and turned back toward the judge. "I rest this portion, Your Honor." She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Carl cleared his throat, louder than necessary. "Didn't know barber shops handed out law degrees now." It wasn't subtle. It wasn't clever. And this time, it wasn't quiet. A few jurors stiffened. The clerk froze mid-typing. Even the bailiff looked away. Danielle turned to him. No expression, no blink, just stillness. That look hung in the air longer than any insult. "I earned my degree, officer," she said softly. "Didn't need a badge to make people listen." Carl's jaw twitched. His fingers fumbled with the folder in front of him. Judge Harlan finally muttered, "Let's move forward. Counselor, proceed." Danielle nodded. She walked with deliberate steps to her seat, opened her folder, and removed a USB drive. "I'd like to introduce video footage from the traffic stop." The gallery leaned forward collectively. Harlan gave a faint nod. "Proceed." She connected the drive. The screen flickered to life. The room darkened just slightly as the overhead lights dimmed. A man sat in a car, hands on the wheel, calm, composed, asking a question. Carl's voice, off-screen, "Step out of the vehicle." The man, "Sir, can I ask what I did?" Then movement. Sudden. Aggressive. Carl yanked the car door open, dragged the man out, slammed him against the hood. The man didn't resist. Didn't even raise his voice. The video ended. Danielle let the silence speak for her. "Officer Readington," she said slowly, "is this consistent with the report you submitted?" Carl didn't answer immediately. He shifted. "There's context." Danielle raised a brow. "Such as?" "National security, suspicious behavior." Sitting calmly with a license in hand is suspicious? Carl opened his mouth, then closed it. Harlan looked down, not in judgment, in discomfort. Danielle stepped closer to the bench, not invading, not challenging, just present. "With respect, Your Honor, this video directly contradicts the report entered into official court records. That's not just a mistake. That's perjury." Harlan frowned. "I'll determine what's relevant here." Danielle didn't raise her voice, but it sharpened. "You're not maintaining order. You're suppressing rights." The sentence hit like a gavel. Murmurs grew louder. A reporter in the back glanced up. The court reporter looked ready to stop typing. Then the doors opened. 2 men in gray suits stepped in, silent as snowfall. They took positions at the back wall. They didn't move, didn't speak. Carl turned. "Who the hell are they?" Danielle didn't turn. "They're here to observe justice." Carl sat down and didn't speak again. Harlan straightened his robe as if trying to regain footing in a room that no longer moved for him. Danielle returned to her seat, slow and controlled. Alberta leaned against the back wall, whispering, "She's just getting started." Danielle adjusted her papers, but her eyes never left Carl. The courtroom hadn't exploded. It hadn't erupted. But the air was heavier, and the walls had begun to lean. The courtroom didn't shake, but something shifted, and it wasn't the furniture. Danielle Monroe sat still, her back straight, eyes forward, the same way she had since stepping into courtroom 4B that morning. But now, everyone else was shifting. A clerk's pen tapped against the desk. A juror crossed and uncrossed their legs. A woman in the gallery slowly lowered her phone, her thumb hovering above the record button. Across the aisle, Officer Carl Readington fidgeted with the edge of a folder he hadn't touched in 10 minutes. His face remained composed, or tried to, but his posture gave him away. The pride in his shoulders had softened into something closer to hesitation. Danielle didn't look at him. Not yet. She reached into her folder and retrieved a second USB drive, quietly, as if it were routine. "I have one more piece of evidence," she said, her voice even. Harland looked up, reluctant. "This better be brief." "It is," Danielle replied, connecting the drive. "It's security footage from inside the precinct holding area." The screen flickered again. No music, no sound cues. Just sterile hallway footage. A timestamp in the corner read, "Day 3 of detainment." The video showed Matthew Langston, her client, sitting alone on a bench outside the intake room, rubbing his eyes, his hands cuffed. Another officer passed him 3 times. No food, no attorney, no paperwork being filed. Then the camera caught Carl. He stepped into the frame, gestured to someone off screen, and said something inaudible. Then he pointed at Matthew, wagged his finger, and mouthed, "He's not going anywhere." The room inhaled. Danielle paused the footage. "I'll remind the court," she said quietly, "that Mr. Langston was booked with no formal charge, no arraignment scheduled until the 5th day, and by policy, no detainment beyond 24 hours without written authority, which doesn't exist." Harlan tapped the edge of his bench with 2 fingers. Carl stood. "I don't recall saying that," he said quickly, gesturing toward the screen. "Could be misinterpreted." Danielle didn't look at the screen. She looked at him. "It isn't," she said. And for the first time, Carl stepped forward too quickly, his voice rising, without permission. "This is all political theater," he snapped. "I've done my job for over a decade without complaint." Danielle tilted her head slightly. "You also detained a man unlawfully and fabricated a report. You've got no proof of intent." Danielle didn't flinch. "I have proof of behavior." Carl's face reddened. He grabbed the nearest folder and walked over, slamming it down on her table harder than before. "Here. Maybe this will help you catch up, counselor." The sound echoed. One of the pens rolled off the edge of the table. A juror flinched. The clerk froze. Alberta stopped pretending to sweep altogether. Danielle looked up at him, calm, centered. "Are you trying to scare me, officer?" she asked softly. Carl gave a smirk, an unconvincing one. "Just trying to help. Some folks need extra support." Still the judge said nothing. Still the bailiff looked away, and that was the moment, the exact moment, where everyone saw it. The crack in the wall, the imbalance. This courtroom didn't protect everyone equally. Danielle picked up the folder Carl had thrown. She didn't open it. She just set it aside, smoothed the sleeve of her jacket, and reached into her pocket. A small flip phone. No fingerprint ID, no facial recognition, just numbers. She typed 3 letters, initiate, and hit send. To most people, it looked like nothing. A quiet woman checking a message. But downtown, several blocks away, a private server registered a data stream. Redundant audio channels lit up. Facial recognition locked in. The courtroom, at that very moment, was being streamed in real time to the office of the Attorney General of Georgia. Not because Danielle was afraid, but because she was finished letting silence bury the truth. Carl turned away, confident he'd put her back in her place. Harland adjusted his glasses, muttering, "Let's not get dramatic." Danielle stood. Her flip phone was gone, slipped back into her coat like it had never existed. "No, Your Honor, not at this time." But something had already happened. You could feel it. Not in the words, in the way the room tilted, emotionally, morally. Alberta Jenkins watched from the corner, her hands now folded, eyes locked on Danielle. "Lord," she whispered, "this man just kicked a hornet's nest in his own house." Carl sat like he'd won something. He hadn't. Danielle didn't raise her voice, didn't shout objection, didn't appeal to emotion. She let the moment stretch, just long enough to rot. She turned back to her table, flipped a page, adjusted her binder like nothing had happened, but something had, because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it moves through the cracks. She rose again. "Your Honor, if the court permits, I'd like to call attention to the timestamp inconsistencies between the arrest log and the dispatch entry." Carl groaned audibly. "Seriously? This is just paper shuffling now." Harlan didn't stop him. Again. Danielle didn't address Carl directly. She walked to the evidence table, placed down the log, the dispatch, the check-in file. All time-stamped. All irrefutable. "This arrest," she said, "took place at 8:47 a.m. The dispatch entry, filed by Officer Readington himself, shows 9:32 a.m., 45 minutes after physical detainment. She let the math do its job. That's unlawful." Another quiet gasp slipped from the gallery. Danielle stepped back. "This isn't just about one man in one courtroom. This is about whether we are willing to look at facts or just keep protecting behavior that's been normalized." Carl stood again, anger flashing. "We tried to revoke her license, you know," he muttered, maybe to Harland, maybe to the gallery. "She was supposed to be gone." That sentence hung in the air too long. Danielle finally looked at him. Her voice dropped lower, almost intimate. "No, officer, you failed to bury me. But you did manage to dig something up." He didn't speak again. Harland rubbed his temples, muttering, "We're adjourned for a recess. 15 minutes. The gavel came down, not with authority, but fatigue. People began to move, quietly, but Alberta didn't. She stepped forward, slowly. For the first time, her broom left her hand completely. "You sound just like your daddy," she said, eyes brimming. "Quiet fire, fire all the same." Danielle looked at her, softly, respectfully. "Hello, Ms. Jenkins." Alberta nodded. "I was here the last time someone tried to speak truth in this room. They dragged him out. I never forgot." Danielle's face didn't move, but her eyes did, toward the gallery, toward the bench, toward the wall where two men in gray suits now stood, still, watching. They didn't carry weapons, they didn't say a word, but they didn't need to, because Danielle Monroe had just begun to speak, and everyone else had just started to listen. You could hear a pin drop. The courtroom, which had once pulsed with a low, judgmental hum, now sat silent. Not out of order, out of awe. The moment the two gray-suited men stepped forward, something invisible snapped into place. One of them, tall, silver hair, no badge visible, walked to the bench and placed a sealed envelope in front of Judge Harland. He whispered something that only Harland could hear. The judge's hand paused mid-motion. His face, so often cloaked in bureaucracy, shifted. Confusion first, then recognition, then something not unlike fear. He broke the seal. The paper inside was thick, official, and final. This can't be right," Harlan murmured. His voice cracked not from age, but from truth catching up. Danielle stepped forward, not hurrying, not hesitating. "You asked who I am," she said softly. She reached into her briefcase. Every eye in the room followed her hand. No one breathed. She pulled out a slim black wallet and flipped it open. The gold gleam of the seal caught the overhead light like a spotlight. State of Georgia Office of the Attorney General. Gasps broke out like thunder. Carl Readington stepped back as if the air itself shoved him. "You're the AG?" he stammered. Danielle didn't blink. Yes. His voice rose. Why didn't you say it earlier? Her eyes didn't flinch. Because masks fall easier when people think you're beneath them. The sentence hit with the weight of a verdict. A juror covered her mouth. Even the bailiff took a half step back. Harland gripped the bench like it might hold him up. Miss Monroe, Attorney General Monroe, if we had known, you would have treated me like a human being, she said, calm, measured. But only if I wore power on my sleeve. The silence after that wasn't empty. It was full of realization, of shame. In the far back of the courtroom, Alberta Jenkins clutched her broom like a life raft. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "She's Cyrus's girl. Oh, Lord, she's his." Danielle turned toward her. "Hello, Miss Jenkins?" Alberta nodded, tears lining her eyes. "Your father always said you'd finish what he started. Quiet fire, he called it." At the prosecution table, someone muttered, "They tried to get her license revoked." Another voice, "She wasn't supposed to be here." Carl looked like he'd been punched in the gut. "So all this was a setup?" he hissed. Danielle turned. "No, officer, this was a test. One you failed, loudly." The men in gray didn't move, but one of them pulled out a small black remote and pressed a button. A second screen flickered to life on the courtroom wall. It showed a live feed of the hearing, streaming directly to the Georgia Department of Justice's secure digital vault. Judge Harland nearly dropped his gavel. "You recorded this entire proceeding?" Danielle gave the faintest smile. "It's amazing what the law allows, when you actually read it." Then she sat down, adjusted her blazer, opened her file. "Let's resume," she said. "I was in the middle of showing how Officer Readington fabricated a traffic stop." There was no gloat in her voice, no vengeance, just precision. Carl's mouth opened, but no sound came. Danielle stood again. "This isn't my first time in this courtroom," she said suddenly, turning toward the gallery. The room hushed itself. Her voice didn't rise, but it pulled every gaze toward her. "I was 17. I sat in that last bench by the aisle," she pointed gently, "and I watched this court destroy a man who asked for fairness." Harland froze, his lips parted slightly. Danielle continued, "His name was Louis Monroe, my father." She let the name settle, and then the walls shifted again. Flashback, not with effects or music, but memory. A courtroom 15 years younger, a black man in a worn gray suit standing at the defense table, his voice firm but polite, asking only for due process. Judge Harland, younger but equally cold, slamming his gavel. "You are in contempt." Two officers dragging Louis Monroe from the courtroom, one juror clapping, and a teenage girl in the gallery, sitting silent, watching her father fall alone. Back in the present, Alberta stepped forward, her voice cracked with age and regret. "I was here. I saw them humiliate him, and I never had the courage to speak up, until now." All eyes turned to her. She didn't cry, but her voice wavered. "Your father. He was brilliant, gentle. He believed in this system more than it deserved." Danielle nodded, her eyes soft. Silence was safer then. Then she turned to the court. "But I'm not 17 anymore, and silence is no longer an option." She walked to the evidence table and laid down a manila folder, faded with time. Inside, transcripts, appeals, motions, all from her father's disbarment, Harland's signature on every page. Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply said, "My father was silenced here. I came back with his voice." Then Carl Readington, like a man drowning in pride, gasped, "Is this part of your defense?" Danielle turned. "No, officer, this is part of your reckoning." No one laughed. No one looked away. And when Danielle said, "I move that this court acknowledge the miscarriage of justice that took place in this very room," not even Harland could form an objection. He just nodded. Slowly. For the first time in years, he looked human and afraid. And in that moment, for the first time all morning, No one underestimated Danielle Monroe. They saw her for who she was, not just a lawyer, not just the Attorney General, but a daughter carrying a storm. The room no longer smelled like judgment, it smelled like reckoning. Carl Readington, once towering with unchecked authority, now sat rigid, arms stiff at his sides. The color had drained from his cheeks, sweat glistened beneath his collar, though the room was cool. Danielle Monroe remained seated, a thick folder now in her hands. She didn't gloat, she didn't rush. She opened it slowly, each page turned with the care of a surgeon. "We have 7 formal charges," she said, voice steady, "including perjury, tampering with evidence, excessive force, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under both state and federal statutes." Carl's lips parted in disbelief. "This is political," he said, but the words lacked weight. "I've served this county for 20 years. Danielle leaned forward slightly. "And how many rights did you trample in that time, Officer Readington?" A juror shifted uncomfortably. Another crossed their arms, unsure what side of history they were sitting on. Judge Harlan didn't move. His eyes were on the gavel, like he didn't recognize it anymore. Danielle didn't need him to act. She nodded to the bailiff. "Please proceed." The bailiff, who'd stood still for nearly half the hearing, hesitated. His gaze flicked to Harlan, who gave no signal, no order. He gave nothing. The bailiff looked back at Danielle. Then slowly, like someone pulling truth from a swamp, he walked toward Carl. And for the first time that morning, the room sighed. Not in relief, in release. The clinking sound of handcuffs echoed against the wood floor. Carl blinked hard, his voice dropping. "You planned this. You set me up." Danielle met his eyes, calm, impenetrable. "No, officer, you did. With every lie, every shove, every time you called someone less because they couldn't push back." As he was escorted from the courtroom, someone whispered from the gallery, "Took long enough." Danielle didn't turn. She didn't need to, because the room had turned with her. Then, something no one expected. Judge Harlan cleared his throat. "I'd like the court's attention." Heads turned. So did Danielle, measured, not surprised. Harlan stood slowly, hands on the edge of the bench. "What I did to your father," he began, voice thinner now, "was wrong." The room didn't gasp this time. It simply listened. "I knew it the moment I did it, but I stayed silent. Too long." Danielle didn't look up from her notes. She wrote something, calmly, deliberately. Then, softly, "It's never too late to step down, just always too late to undo." Harlan didn't fight. He didn't flinch. "I resign from this bench, effective immediately," he said. "Let the record show it." Gasps now, not of shock, but of realization. Harlan removed his robe, folded it neatly, and stepped down. No applause, just the quiet sound of justice, finally sitting down at the table. Danielle looked up, just for a moment, watched him disappear behind the courtroom doors, no longer untouchable, no longer the voice that decided who mattered. Alberta Jenkins walked toward the defense table, slow, trembling. She laid a hand on the wood, aged fingers tapping gently. "Louis would be proud," she said, tears glinting. "He'd be proud of what you just did." Danielle turned toward her, eyes glassy but unshaken. "I hope he'd say the same about what comes next." Alberta smiled, a small, knowing one. "He would." And then she sat down again, in her old corner, where she had always been, where she had once watched injustice happen, and now watched it unravel. The agents remained at the rear wall, still, unblinking. The courtroom remained full, but no one spoke louder than a whisper, because something had settled. Not just a verdict, a shift. Danielle walked slowly to her chair. She reached for the next folder. It was thinner than the last, But she handled it the same, with care, with purpose. Because justice, she knew, didn't always thunder in. Sometimes it walked. She didn't roar. She turned the page. The courtroom was quiet, no longer a chamber of judgment, but a cathedral of possibilities. Danielle Monroe sat behind her desk in her Attorney General's office early that morning. Sunlight trickled through tall windows, dancing across piles of reopened case files. The candles of justice, once smothered in that courtroom, now flickered in front of her. A small envelope lay on her desk, a handwritten note from a 9-year-old girl named Naya in Michigan, scrawled in uneven letters. Some people are loud and still wrong, but you were quiet and still right. Danielle read it twice, letting it sink in. She folded it, placing it on top of a petition, one demanding statewide judicial reform and systemic oversight. 4 days ago, it had arrived with over 12,000 signatures by mail. She stared at them both. No cameras, no speeches, just action. She signed at the bottom of the petition with a precise stroke. Quiet, resolute. Every name had a story. Someone who'd believed again, someone who needed hope. She didn't celebrate. She didn't mark the moment with fanfare. She simply let the ink dry. Later, in a quiet corridor, Alberta Jenkins navigated her cane toward Danielle's office. Retired now, the janitor still cared with gentle persistence. She placed a bouquet of fresh lilies near the window. Simple, white, purposeful. Outside, beyond the courthouse steps, a small boy lingered each morning since the story aired, worn sneakers, oversized jacket, and eyes full of hope. He looked up at Danielle's window. He lifted his finger to his lips, one gentle shh, not mocking, just clear. A gesture that mirrored Danielle's courtroom calm, power without volume. Alberta smiled when she saw the boy. "He's been coming every morning," she whispered. "Just to see if you're real." Danielle walked over, looked out, and nodded softly. "He's not the one who needs to see me," she murmured back. "The system does." Outside, people climbed the steps, some anxious, some hopeful. Danielle saw not themselves, but a vision, a community longing for justice delivered with dignity. She placed her hand on the window pane, as if feeling the pulse of change beyond glass. Then she turned back, returned to the files. One case called to her, a juvenile sentencing discrepancy in Monroe County. Her phone buzzed. "Incoming. Office of Legal Oversight. Urgent review request." She exhaled to herself, steady, familiar. She didn't don her badge. She merely lifted it, held it for a heartbeat, then tucked it away. Then she lifted the case file. "Let's begin again," she whispered to the empty room. And outside, 2 stalwart words echoed quietly in her heart. Silence, when it comes from strength, not fear. Dee on quiet feet, and flipped the entire room. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it walks in quietly, carries a binder, and sits where it's not supposed to belong. Danielle Monroe didn't just win a case, she reclaimed a legacy, one buried beneath decades of silence, and she did it without ever raising her voice. Her story isn't just about one courtroom, or one corrupt officer, or even one unjust judge. It's about a system that too often punishes the soft voices, especially when they come from the Black community. For years, the Black community has carried the weight of injustice in silence. But silence, when it comes from strength, not fear, can be revolutionary. Danielle didn't demand attention. She earned it. With every page she turned, every lie she exposed, and every truth she spoke calmly into the chaos. And if this story moved you, if you felt even a fraction of the frustration, the fire, or the dignity that Danielle carried, that's not an accident. That's the story echoing through generations of the Black community, asking not just to be heard, but to be respected. So if you're listening now, ask yourself, where are you in this system? And what are you willing to do when justice walks in? Not with a shout, but with a purpose?